Hello, this is a presentation on Cuba and disaster management. This presentation was created and narrated by Felicia O'Brien. As any country around the world, Cuba has an array of hazards and vulnerabilities. Some of these major hazards include hurricanes, landslides, and earthquakes. Because of Cuba's specific geographical location in the Caribbean region, it is highly susceptible to frequent and strong hurricanes. Many Cuban residents choose to reside in areas that are highly vulnerable to landslides. Areas that receive a great amount of rainfall are more vulnerable to landslides. Cuba is also victim to seismic activity. Earthquakes easily destroy homes, buildings, and important transportation ways and infrastructures. Cuba's approach and rationale is a lot different from others. Hurricanes are the number one hazard that Cuba prepares for, as it is the most kind of devastating disaster. They implement what is seen as a four-phase approach, starting with the informative phase, which is implemented 2 days before a hurricane arrives. The public is contacted through television and radio, so they are informed that a hurricane is likely to hit. Next, a second alert is commenced a day later to warn citizens that a hurricane will soon hit and prepare for evacuation. Several hours later, the public is told when the hurricane will strike. Finally, all vehicles prepare to take civilians to higher ground. This does not only include government-issued transportation. This is a community-based evacuation in which neighbors help each other and provide transportation for one another. The rationale behind this approach is because it is highly successful in saving lives. When hurricanes strike the Caribbean region and the United States, Cuba usually has less casualties than anyone else, but usually they get hit the hardest. Because lack of funding, what Cuba lacks in mitigation techniques, they make up for in education of preparedness and evacuation. They rely so heavily on evacuation that it is mandatory, and those who refuse to evacuate are issued fines. Because Cuba is known for their communist regime, they implement a top-down style of implementation in which their government is responsible for disaster management. Even though this type of implementation style is sometimes ineffective, Cuba uses it to their advantage and successfully. This type of implementation style might promote emergent norms, but in this case it does not, because citizens know their responsibilities through an early age because preparedness is implemented all through grade school and consistently onwards. Participants in Cuba's disaster preparedness include the Cuban government, who are responsible for disaster policy, the Cuban military, who help with evacuations and response efforts, Cuban civilians, because evacuations are mostly carried out by community groups that take cues from the government, and lastly, NGOs and UN humanitarian groups who help with recovery efforts. Budgeting and funding is a great obstacle to Cuba's disaster management because it greatly hinders mitigation efforts, which in turn gives all the pressure to preparedness activities. In return, there has been increased education as there is more extensive preparedness training from grades 1 to 6, relying on their 99.8 literacy rate. Also, the reliance on evacuation is a product from ineffective mitigation and preparedness techniques that eventually shaped disaster management planning for Cuba.